So my understanding is you've done quite a bit of historical research on just exactly what was happening in the post-67 space, both politically and socially in the country, and how what we see today is what appears to many to be this sort of intractable intertwining between the two publics in the West Bank. You've managed to pull apart exactly how that happened and in what way it developed. And it's not necessarily as clear-cut a story as many people might tend to believe. So what can you tell me about the kinds of documents you drew upon and what exactly you were able to learn from looking at the actual textual evidence in depth?
The standard Israeli narrative, specifically dealing with Israeli settlement in the occupied territories, first of all, focuses very, very heavily on the West Bank. And the standard story is that settlement came to be because following the war in 1967, a group of young Orthodox Zionists, religious Zionists, whose views were transformed by the war, wanted Israel to keep what they called the whole land of Israel, put pressure on the government to establish settlements. That the first of those settlements was at a place called Kfar Tzion between Bethlehem and Hebron, where there had in fact been a religious kibbutz before 1948 that had fallen to Arab forces on the eve, literally on the eve, the day before the State of Israel was declared. It went on to putting pressure on the government to settle in the city of Hebron in the West Bank, eventually had a huge confrontation with the first Rabin government in 1974 and 1975 about settling in the northern West Bank, particularly a place called Sebastia, an Arab village outside of Nablus. And eventually the government backed down and let them do so. And then in 1977, the political right took power and gave much freer rein to this religious movement to establish settlements. Sometimes it's told as religious fanatics pressured a moderate but wishy-washy labor government to allow settlement in the occupied territories, and sometimes it's told as patriotic religious Zionists successfully pressured a defeatist labor government to allow settlement in the liberated territories. And the connotations are obviously important, but the story is the same story. One reason that the story is the same story is that much of the Israeli account comes from the religious settlers. They acted publicly and spoke publicly and were very eager most of the time for publicity. And that's the story that I knew as a journalist for years, because that's the story that's regularly repeated in various forms in the Israeli media. And
so this is sort of a public narrative that formed kind of organically as a function of whose voices were loudest in
it's a function of it's a function of what was covered in the press, but what it also does in terms of contemporary terms is it casts settlement as a project of religious Zionism, and it successfully maps the political conflict over whether and how much to settle in occupied territory. It maps that conflict onto the religious secular Kulturkampf, which pre-existed which is sort of goes back to the very beginning of the Zionist movement, and which remains one of the hottest issues in Israeli society, particularly in the elite intellectual level of Israeli society.
Just to clarify, that this is the conflict between the role of religion in the Zionist project? Is that what you mean?
It's a conflict over whether the Zionist project should be essentially a secular project and whether the life of Jews in the modern world should essentially be secular versus whether all those things should essentially be religious. But that's an argument that goes back to the beginning of Zionism. And by presenting by understanding the settlement project in those terms, you get a very nice division. Everything lines up.
Yeah, it's sort of a neat and tidy way of conceptualizing.
Right. And I will state one of my sort of overall views of looking at history, which is in part a result of working on this project. History is not neat and tidy, and things don't line up. And the fact that people agree on one cause does not mean that they agree on another cause. And anytime you've got things that neat and tidy, you're probably missing a lot. So that's already a problem with it. But the real problem is that when I started doing archival work, I intended to write a book about the first 10 years of settlement because I thought that was a period that needed to be explained. And I assumed the book would look something like the narrative that I just told you. And from the moment I started doing serious historical research, getting into archives, looking at really obscure pieces of writing, going back and talking, I started working on the project in 2003, so a great number of the people who'd been involved at the beginning in 1967 were still alive and available for interviewing, and at the same time, lots and lots of government documents that had been secret were being declassified. And another chunk of documents got declassified because they were in the Israeli Army Archive, the IDF archive, which did not want me to see those documents. So I was able to see material that had not been accessible to the public before. So let me tell you the story as things actually developed, which is that from the moment that the war ended, there were various people in Israeli society who were interested in settlement in the occupied territories, not just in the West Bank, but also in the Golan Heights, and eventually in the Gaza Strip and in the Sinai Peninsula, which was under Israeli rule after the Six-Day War in June 1967. The actual first settlement in occupied territory was established in July of 1967, 5 weeks after the war ended, in the Golan Heights. And it was created by a group of very left-wing secular kibbutzniks from the north.
Left-wing secular kibbutzniks.
Right. With the support of a high officer in the army, a local government in the Galilee, and the labor ministry, which was then under the Minister of Labor at the time was a man named Yigal Allon, who was a very central figure in Israeli politics and was one of the leaders of the left-wing Achdut Avodah, Unity of Labor party, which was very much based in left-wing kibbutzim and which had been pro-Soviet until the 50s.
Just to pause for a moment and to clarify for our viewers or listeners, the notion in Israel of left-wing versus right-wing doesn't always neatly map onto the left-wing and right-wing.
So that's a great question. Until 1967, the notion of left-wing and right-wing in Israel was exactly what it was in Europe. The moderate left-wingers were social democrats. The radical left-wingers were much more radical socialists. Until the 50s, many of them were pro-Moscow, and the break with Moscow in the 50s was very traumatic. The right side of the spectrum was bourgeois and capitalist, moving over to groups that were at least quasi-fascistic in their viewpoints. And that political split was the political split of Israel. Now, there was another layer of politics in Israel, which was secular versus religious. But even among secular Zionists, there were people who were socialists and capitalists. The map of the Israeli parliament looked like the map of sort of generic European parliament. And the Communist Party was represented in parliament, and these radical right-wing groups were. The range is much, much wider than, say, an American political range. Gradually, since 1967, those terms have been transformed to mean, are you in favor of giving up territory or holding on to it? So the idea of somebody who's left-wing, who's in favor of holding on to territory, in the terms of 2017, is an internal contradiction.
Exactly.
But prior to 1967, in each of those camps, you had people who believed in the idea of what's called the whole land of Israel. The people on the left who believed in that view basically thought that the mandatory borders, and all the more so the armistice borders after 1949, were an artificial imperialist imposition that divided up the natural homeland of the Jews. In the same way that if you were a left-wing Vietnamese, you said that the division of Vietnam into North and South was an imperialist imposition and was unnatural and was something to overcome.
Right. Although, interestingly, maybe this isn't the right way to think about it, so to speak, but the national mythology that dictated what was the natural space in which, the Jewish people were supposed to be redeveloping their nation was based on, at least nominally, religious text. I mean, it had been reinterpreted in secular nationalist terms. But unlike in other decolonizing contexts, the founding national mythology, even though it was taken up by leftists who were largely secular, was nonetheless the founding religious text of Western civilizations, which is kind of confusing for people.
Well, yeah, but only if you ignore the history of every other national movement in the world. Nationalism essentially came into its own in the 19th century. The intellectual roots go before that. But the idea of defining people by national communities dates philosophically to before the French Revolution. Politically, it's very much developed across Europe as a result of the French Revolution. And national communities needed myths that described their roots and their background and their past and who they were. And sometimes they created those myths by reworking their histories, and sometimes they bought a used myth off the shelf and reworked it.
Not to get too bogged down in this, I just find it interesting that often those myths have, that they have a truly mythological character, but very rarely is it God gave us this land, we don't believe in him, but this is our national myth anyway. It's interesting that there seems.
I'm not going to try to go through a catalog of national movements, but the combination of secularism and God is on our side is certainly not. Zionists relate to the game of nationalism, and the models were all there. But one of the things that secular Zionism did, and this is part of the Kulturkampf that I was referring to before, is that secular Zionism said the Bible is our national story. The religious part of it is basically not relevant. That's how people thought in those days, but the critically important part of it is the national story. What that also meant is that they studied very different parts of the Bible than people who were focusing on the religious parts of it did. But the Bible is taught in secular Israeli schools as the history of the Jewish nation.
So it's taken as an historical document, essentially, used in mythological and identity building.
That doesn't mean that people don't do all the biblical criticism and the analysis of what the text means and does it line up with archaeological finds. In fact, that became a fascination of Israeli activity, was the comparison between what you found in the field archaeologically and what was written in the text. But the text was basically taken as a historical, clearly written in mythological terms, but a historical account. This is where we started. Our nation goes back to here. The Jews are the descendants of the ancient Judeans, and this is where we start out, and this is the only homeland we've ever had. And that homeland is not defined by a bunch of lines. To go back to what we were saying before, is if you were either on the radical left or the radical right or a certain radical wing of religious Zionism, to accept these imposed lines set down by a bunch of imperial powers sitting somewhere in Europe, that's your national homeland, well, it's not as if the Jews were the only people not to be happy with those lines. That's the history of the 20th century in Europe, even more than here. So there were people on the radical left as well who, for instance, were very much against the partition of Palestine by the United Nations in 1947, who came to live with the armistice lines after 1949, but didn't think of them as, they were very far from being ideal. And along comes the war in 1967, and Israel conquers the Golan Heights and the West Bank and Gaza and the Sinai, and people say, wow, this is much more, people of those camps say this is much more the way things are supposed to look.
There's a certain coherence with what had just happened, even if what had happened was, in a sense, unplanned.
Oh, no, not in a sense. The 1967 war was the only Middle East war that clearly neither side wanted. It was a case of brinkmanship that went over the brink. So Israel comes out with this territory, but there's some people in Israeli society for whom there's an ideological framework to say, oh, and it was ours all along, so we should keep it.
Right, which includes elements of what at the time were still considered the left.
Exactly. Very much so. And the project of creating settlement in the territories largely was initiated by government bodies, supported by government bodies, funded by government bodies, and in which the religious Zionist activists were what I call fractious clients. That is to say, like most clients, they didn't always agree with their patron, and they had disagreements, and there were conflicts between them, but basically they were fit into this larger project.
Right, the religious Zionist settlers that came to play a dominant role, I suppose, in this project. But as you said, some of the first settlements that were constructed were secular, left-wing.
Okay, so let's go on with what happened. So, for instance, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, in that summer of 1967, there's various pieces of evidence that he was very interested in the idea of reestablishing Jewish points of settlement where Jews had lived in the West Bank before 1948.
Right, so these are areas that had been settled by people in the Yishuv, essentially, prior to the existence of the State of Israel, and then they left
Right, the
in the
number
context
of communities and of people among the Jews who either were expelled or fled in 1948 was much smaller than the number of Arabs because the Jews did better on the battlefield. But there were places where Jews lived where either they were forcibly expelled or where they fled. And so, for instance, when the government made the decision immediately after the war to annex what it called East Jerusalem, it actually annexed an area that was much bigger than the Jordanian municipality of Jerusalem. And when they drew the border, one of the many criteria for drawing that new municipal border was taking in the spots called Atarot and Neve Yaakov, where there had been Jewish farming communities before 1948 that had been abandoned during the fighting. Eshkol was interested in reestablishing the kibbutz of Beit Arava, which was a kibbutz that existed at the north end of the Dead Sea before 48. Eventually, when settlement started in Gaza, they established a kibbutz called Kfar Darom, which took the place of the kibbutz Kfar Darom, which had been the southernmost of the Negev settlements that had existed in mandatory Palestine before 1948. There's a pattern to this.
Right, so in the mind of even these very mainline political actors, Israeli political actors, this is essentially just undoing historical injustice, relatively recent historical injustice.
Right.
However, and correct me if I'm wrong, under the body of international law as it existed at the time, it was relatively clear that this was not acceptable unless it was somehow tied to military necessity. Is that correct?
One of the signs that Eshkol himself was interested in creating a settlement at Kfar Tzion is that his bureau sent a question to the legal advisor of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, a man named Theodore Meron, who was a brilliant young international lawyer, and they said,
he ended up becoming involved with the Yugoslavian tribunals.
He ended up being the president of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
It seems that he would have known what he was talking about.
Yeah. So he wrote back to Eshkol, and the paper trail shows that this memo was sent to Eshkol and to Foreign Minister Abba Eban and to Defense Minister Moshe Dayan and to Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapira, and he said, civilian settlement in the occupied territories violates, he said administered territories because that was the official bureaucratic term in Israel. Civilian settlement in the administered territories violates explicit provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention.
He said that outright. This is an Israeli advising other Israelis, his own leadership.
Top secret, says top secret at the top. It's a totally internal document. And he takes into account the fact that some of these places had existed as Jewish settlement beforehand, and he pretty much says that doesn't change the international legal situation. And he also says that international law, that the Fourth Geneva Convention allows the occupying power to establish temporary military bases in occupied territory.
It does allow a temporary occupying power to establish military bases.
Because the Fourth Geneva Convention is essentially there to protect the civilian population, and it balances the needs of the civilian population with the military needs of the occupying power. And it does not relate to whether the occupation took place as part of a just or an unjust war. That's not the issue. The issue is you're ruling over a population of people who are not part of your state. What are their rights guaranteed by the international community? So those rights include the fact that you're not going to settle part of your population in their territory. On the other hand, for immediate military needs, you can, how did you get there? There was a state of war. You have security needs. You can establish temporary military bases. Right. So the official announcement about Kfar Tzion was that it was going to be an outpost of part of the army known as Nahal, which was a branch of the army in which young people drafted into the army, and as part of their army service, they lived in paramilitary agricultural settlements at strategic points and alternated between military and agricultural duties, and it was in fact legally a military base.
A sort of convenient gray zone of both settlement and legitimate military existence.
At a later point, I found a memo in the Army archives by the colonel who was essentially in charge of administering the occupied territories, in which he says publicly this is going to be presented as a Nachal base. It actually has no connection to the army.
And that's actually written in the documents that you were able to uncover.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised at that. I sort of figured that, I knew that had been the cover story and that it was a cover story, but honestly I did not expect to find it in writing.
In terms of the duplicity of Israeli government intentions with respect to the settlement project, I mean, awkwardly for those who would want to defend the Israeli government position at the time, that is, if not the definition of a smoking gun, I don't know what is.
It was clearly presented in a false manner both to the Israeli public and to the international community in order to fit it into the legal framework. At least at the moment that that was done, it testifies to accepting that that was the legal framework and finding a ruse for getting around it. Now, at a later point, not much later point, the Israeli government and a couple of legal scholars who supported it came up with legal arguments for why the Fourth Geneva Convention did not apply to the West Bank and therefore this wasn't illegal. But at the time they did this, the only thing they had in hand was Meron's opinion, and that's why they called it a military outpost. Okay, so to get back to the main story, you have the government actively working to create this settlement in occupied territory. Now, the government had not reached a conclusion and was incapable of reaching a conclusion about the future of the occupied territories as a whole or the future of the West Bank, because for two reasons. One is that on the eve of the 67 war, essentially a war cabinet had been formed, a national unity government that included almost the full range of Israeli politics. But second of all, even within the ruling parties themselves, the central parties in the coalition, there was a tremendous amount of disagreement about how to handle this problem of the future of the territories, of the occupied territories. So the government never came up with an explicit program. But in lieu of that, it initiated and supported settlement activity in a number of areas in the occupied territories, which included the Golan Heights, certain parts of the Sinai Peninsula, eventually in the Gaza Strip, and in various parts of the West Bank. Now, when it came to the West Bank, there were various ideas about where the government should establish settlements. The same Yigal Allon, who was a very important and prominent member of the government, came up with this plan, which was literally presented to the government again in July of 1967, in which he said, we should annex and settle the less populated areas of the West Bank. And as for the more populated areas, which is basically the mountain ridge area north of Jerusalem and possibly the mountain ridge area south of Jerusalem, we should be willing either to have some form of Palestinian government there or return it to Jordanian rule.
So the way I'm picturing that in my head is it would create sort of an autonomous enclave, autonomous if ruled by the Palestinians, or a Jordanian-administered enclave within Israeli security perimeters that would extend down to the Jordan River, essentially. Is that sort of, was that Allon's vision?
Allon's original concept, he wasn't even willing to have that area be called a Palestinian state. But his idea was that before Allon was a member of one of the left-wing Whole Land of Israel parties, until the war in 67, he was known as a firm supporter of the idea that the whole land of Israel, which included the West Bank, belonged to Israel. And he moderated his opinions from extremely hawkish to mildly hawkish as a result of the war, because he said, if we hold on to that whole Arab population and we annex it and we give them citizenship, then we're not going to have a Jewish state anymore. On the other hand, he believed that you needed the areas along the Jordan River and the Dead Sea for security reasons. So he said, guess what? There's not that many people living there. So we'll annex and settle those parts. And the parts that are higher up in the mountains, where there's lots of people living, we're willing to relinquish those under the right diplomatic conditions. There were a couple problems with this. One was there was no partner for that agreement, and that was pretty clear very early on. But one of the arguments for a lot of this policy was, particularly when it came to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, was our lines with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were armistice lines. Those are not permanent international boundaries. In the crisis leading up to the war, the Arab states have essentially violated that armistice, and therefore we are no longer bound by armistice agreements. One of the ironies of the historical situation is, perhaps as a result of the war, more and more the international community came to recognize those pre-war boundaries as being, for all practical purposes, international boundaries. And in the immediate wake of the war, there's pretty strong historical evidence that King Hussein of Jordan was very eager for a peace agreement on the basis of the full return of the West Bank.
To Jordanian sovereignty at the time, right?
Yeah.
Which is quite distinct from the situation where people are familiar with today, who didn't live through this. Yeah.
Right. So the government never adopted Allon's plan outright, But it did start creating settlements in a lot of those areas. On the other hand, Alon's great rival, Moshe Dayan, said, no, that's not how we're going to do it. He also wanted to keep land and give it up at the same time. But his idea was, he said strategically, the most important land was the mountain ridge. You can't possibly give that up.
Because it's literally the high land. People
Well,
could
he
send
was
mortar
talking in
shells or
terms
whatnot.
of where you establish radar monitoring stations and so forth. There was a whole military doctrine behind this too, although what was military and what was political is, I mean, you'd need to be telepathic over historical time to figure that out.
Right, indeed. But I mean, it is worth keeping in mind, I suppose, that there were intense political rivalries within this even elite Israeli cadre. So if one person had a vision, it was almost useful to have an alternative vision.
The general
in and of
rule
itself.
was that if Alon said something, Dayan would say something else. Alon would say what he was saying very clearly. You did not know what Dayan was going to say, but you knew it would be different from what Alon was going to say.
Right.
So Dayan said, let's keep the mountain ridge, let's establish Israeli cities there. We should keep permanent rule over the West Bank, but we should turn the civilian rule either over to Palestinian autonomy or create what's called a condominium shared rule with Jordan. They'll be in charge of civilian affairs, we'll be in charge of security, but Israelis will be able to settle anywhere they want in the West Bank. So you have that disagreement from day one, essentially from day one. Both of those proposals were presented to the cabinet before the summer was out in 1967.
And their interest in finding some sort of solution for how to administer this large non-Jewish Arab population was, I assume, they had their eyes wide open with respect to if we were to grant all these people citizenship, it would be the end of the Zionist project.
In the crucial cabinet meeting, two-day cabinet meeting, which was held June 18th to 19th, 1967, a week after the war, the justice minister, responding to Dayan's idea in particular, said, if we do what Dayan says, limited Arab autonomy while we continue to rule, everybody's going to say this is a colony. And in an era of decolonialization, you can't do that. Every progressive person will rise up against us and say they're trying to turn the West Bank into a colony.
And they said this in 67, a week after.
A week after the war.
So immediately.
Immediately. And again, this is not some campus radical at the Sorbonne with a megaphone. This is the Justice Minister of the State of Israel, right? And he said, on the other hand, if we annex the West Bank and we give everybody citizenship, he said literally, in so many words, that will be the end of the Zionist project.
He literally said that word. That is actually, that
I'm
was the
translating,
admission.
obviously, but that's what he said. This is the end of the Zionist project.
So there was a knowledge right from the beginning that this was a
So
conundrum.
there was the basic psychological, political, strategic, mythological, emotional problem faced by the people in the cabinet was, how do you have your cake and eat it too? Or as Levi Eshkol said on several occasions, with the war we got a wonderful dowry. The problem with the dowry is that with it comes the wife.
Just out of curiosity, so do we have any sense of what the feeling was amongst the wider Israeli public at this time about that territory? Were these politicians thinking, you know, we have at our backs here, or as in our potential voters, a population that's exuberant that we now have access, so to speak, to this territory once again? Or was the public themselves also sort of scratching their heads about, well, okay, but what do we do with this? Did they?
There was wide debate in the general public as well, but as much as I can reconstruct the mood, a little bit from polling figures, a lot from cultural things, there was a tremendous amount of stunned ecstasy after the war.
Right, but keyword ecstasy, people were very excited about
Okay, but you have to also remember the psychology of this. People went into the war. The military leadership was very confident going into the war. One might even say to the level of hubris. Things went their way, so it doesn't look like hubris. But if you were just like sitting in a war college looking at their confidence, you might say, guys, you know, cool your engines. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to work out the way that you want it to.
Take it down a notch.
Yeah, but by their incredible good fortune, it did work out. This was one astounding military gamble that went exactly right. In fact, was much more successful than they could have planned on. So you have this combination of existential fear followed immediately by unprecedented victory.
Right, because the population themselves didn't necessarily have that same confidence that the military elite would have had at the time, right? Yeah, so people felt that they were staring their fate, you know, in the face. Like staring down the Egyptian gun, so to speak, and then, then things flipped.
There had been a brief war in the Sinai with Egypt in 1956, but the last real and very live experience people had of war was in 1948, where 1 out of 100 Israelis was killed in the war. It was a very painful and brutal war, and victory was by no means assured. And here you had all these Arab armies lined up, and you're not sitting in military intelligence, and you know, as the common citizen or even the common Knesset member, you don't actually know what the relative military strength is. You know that Nasser has just lined up with King Hussein of Jordan and with the Syrian government, and at the last moment with the Iraqi government, and they all want to invade and wipe you out.
Right.
6 days later, you're on top of the world. So the idea that we should give this up for peace was, I don't think, a majority position by any means. And it varied by piece of territory, but my memory is that if there was a piece of land people were least interested in giving it up, it was the West Bank.